Sarah Lohman, and I'm going to talk to you today. So I wrote this book, 8 Flavors, The Untold Story of American Cuisine. My job in life is I'm a historical gastronomist, meaning I look at what we ate and drank in the past to understand why we eat and drink what we do today. So I focus on both food and drinks. I focus on American history. And what I did in this book, 8 Flavors, The Untold Story of American Cuisine, is I picked 8 flavors that are considered the most commonly used, the most popular in American cooking, and I use these flavors to help define American cuisine, which I think in the first place people don't think we have. We're a little bit disparaging, even to ourselves, about what American food is. But the argument I put forward is that our cuisine is the most complicated and diverse on the planet, based on all the places that people came from, based on our heritage, all coming together and evolving to something entirely new. Now, sometimes that can be difficult to define as a whole, so I looked at flavor. In this book, I talk about 8 different flavors: black pepper, vanilla, chili powder, curry powder, soy sauce, garlic, monosodium glutamate or MSG, and sriracha. The story is about these flavors, but I think more importantly, it's also about the people behind these flavors, that it's often an individual representing maybe a larger immigrant group or colonialization or a huge change in science that is affecting how we eat forever. So I wrote this book. It's in the market, and I'm also going to be signing books from 1 to 2 p.m. today at the Shots of Inspiration, so come by and say hi. Philip, who puts together the educational seminars for this, called me and said, "Do you think you can do this for Mixology?" And I said, well, I didn't immediately say, well, sure. I said, that's going to be a lot of work, Philip. What are you doing to me? But when I gave it thought, I realized how important this idea is to mixology history, because one of our proudest culinary inventions here in America is the cocktail. We invented it. That's why we're here in New Orleans today, because this is something we contributed to the world. Even in the 19th century, when Europe still thought we had terrible music, terrible writing, they would at least credit us for cocktails. That's not even an exaggeration. So what we're going to do today is we're going to do an overview of mixology history, of drinking history, mostly focused on America, but we'll start in prehistory, the things that came from Europe, really the beginning of distilling. And we're going to use flavor and flavor trends to sort of paint a picture of how drinking culture has changed over time in this country. So we're going to look at flavor, we're going to look at the types of drinks that are featuring these flavors and how that changed over time, and we're also going to look at the context of where these drinks were consumed and by whom, because that has certainly changed too. Just the fact that I'm standing up here and looking around this room, and I would say half of this room are women, that is, yes ladies, taking over tails. That is a really big change, even in the last 20 to 30 years of drinking culture. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about gender roles. We're going to talk about private versus public. We're going to talk about all the things. And I'm going to leave time at the end for questions, but if you don't get a chance to ask me questions, I will be awkwardly standing in the back of Evangeline, which is the room outside of registration, which is where they will put all of the panelists at Sonesta for the rest of the weekend, by the way, and you can come talk to me there, or you can come talk to me at the book signing from 1 to 2 p.m. So does that sound okay? Okay. Yes. There will also be some drinking too, don't worry. All right, let's begin at the beginning. Oh my, you're taking notes. Holy shit. This is a Wednesday thing. I can't wait to see how many of you are taking notes by Saturday. I'm lucky if I make my 10:30 a.m. seminars by Saturday. All right, so let's talk about juniper. And I'm going to talk about juniper because this was really the very first flavoring in alcohol, period. So let me tell you a little bit about the plant first. It is in the pine family. What we call juniper berries are actually teeny tiny pine cones. The next time you've got some juniper in your hand, take a close look at them and you'll see the characteristic sort of scales of a pine cone. It's a very fleshy cone. The chemicals that make up the flavors of juniper, this very pine-like aroma, the main one is called pinene. And pinene is shared by other pine and also by rosemary too. So that's that typical pine flavor. But there's another prominent chemical called limonene, and limonene is in things like coriander. It's really responsible for citrus notes in a lot of herbaceous plants. So we've got pine versus citrus, which particularly later on as infusions of juniper in distilled alcohol, otherwise known as gin, get a little bit more complicated. Things are added to complement these notes, primarily things that share these two chemicals, this pine chemical or this sort of citrusy chemical. Now, this goes all the way back to the beginning of distilling. No one is quite sure when distilling evolved. People are pretty sure that it began in Persia, and it was being used to create things like rose water, orange flower water, essentially, not really drinkable alcohols. I guess I want to note that basically everything delicious in the modern world started in Persia. So if you know someone from Persia, give them a hug today. They also invented ice cream. So, right. So it's a very, very important sort of origin point for a lot of touchstones within our culture. So this is a very early still. This one is probably from Europe, probably from the 16th or 17th century, but you probably know how distilling works if you're sitting in this room, but you can tell it's the basic principle that you're heating a lower proof alcohol, and the alcohol boils sooner than the water. It steams out into these fun little bladdery looking things in this case, or it steams out into a cooling coil in a modern era, and then the result is you've got a higher proof alcohol, something that has more alcohol as opposed to water, which you can then distill again and do the same thing over and over again. So initially this process was created by alchemists, and it was seen as being somewhat magical. And the earliest distilled spirits were medicinal as well. The first thing that we distilled, other than things that were used as flavorants or perfumes, was wine into brandy. But pretty soon after, we started distilling grain-based spirits into alcohol. So basically, yeah, brandy is distilled wine. Any sort of liquor is distilled beer, in a sense, where it's a grain-based fermented mash that is then distilled to a higher proof. And this original Nutrigrain spirit was called aqua vitae, water of life. And it was used to treat maladies, probably not too much aid, probably, but it was discovered that you can infuse things like juniper in it, and it infused better than water, that the alcohol would pull the important chemicals out, and that you were making these medicinal tinctures out of this aqua vitae base. So the earliest medicinal tincture that we really know about is one made with juniper, and it was particularly popular in Holland by the 16th century. So you see where we're going with this. People began to feel in their hearts and their bodies that, hey, maybe this aqua vitae stuff is not just good for my health, maybe it tastes good all the time. And that's really how drinking culture started. It was seen as self-medication. There's actually a whole seminar coming up later this week about I think it's called From the Medicine Cabinet to the Bar, something like that, about how all these alcohols started with the idea these were healthy for you, and that getting up and starting to drink in the morning was simply medicating yourself. So Juniper is the original gin. It comes out of Holland in the 17th century. It's known as Dutch courage, and it passes to England in the middle of the 17th century when the English are fighting the Dutch, and they notice the Dutch are quite brave after they have some of this juniper. The original juniper is very, very juniper heavy, and when it crosses the water and goes to England, they begin blending it with sugar as well as other spices like coriander. Now, this was different than anything people had been drinking regularly before. For the most part, if you were wealthy, you were drinking wine. If you were not, you were drinking ale. So let's just say people were alarmed. This is a drawing from the 17th century. The whole idea in England, this was called the gin craze. And actually at the time, gin referred to any distilled spirit. It was sort of shorthand, but prominently people were drinking gin. Now, you look at this image and you can see very, very clearly what some people thought about gin drinking. It is being served to people by death, masked in beauty there. There is a mother who is feeding it to her child. And that was a lot of the fear, that because this drink was sweet, that it was going to appeal to women and to children in a way that alcohol hadn't before, and that would be morally corrupt. There's another very famous lithograph called Beer Alley versus Gin Lane. It's drawn by Hogarth. Give it a Google. Basically, some of you have seen it. Everyone in Beer Alley is prosperous and plump and fecund and productive. And then over in Gin Lane, there's like a mom dropping her baby. There's like someone vomiting in a corner. Okay, so why? We're familiar with the temperance movement, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the temperance movement in just a moment, too. But this specifically had to do, well, with some things that might not surprise you now. Up until this point, aqua vitae was only a drink of the wealthy. The wealthy were using it to medicate. It was quite expensive. And by 1763, it had become extremely common, easy to produce, and inexpensive. In fact, there were so many gin houses like this one in London that there was one for every 11 households. So part of the problem with this is that people who were wealthy felt that people who were poor shouldn't be drinking the same thing as them. So that, on one hand, is why they're painting images like this. So this is bad for you because there's a bit of a class war going on here, too. The other thing is gender. Rich women drank wine at home privately, but poor women had nowhere to drink. They certainly couldn't afford wine, and ale houses were men only. Gin shops, on the other hand, in the 18th century, were run by women, just like the beautiful woman you see here, and would serve women. This was a place where women could stop and have a drink on their way home from work, on their way out to the store, the first public place where they could purchase alcohol and drink it publicly and be somewhere else other than at home or work. And men didn't like that. So another huge issue here was gin was actually tied into a little bit of liberation for women, and also, let's say, a shaming of the poor. That the point is that people who are poor are spending their money on alcohol when they should be saving it for other things, which is something we still hear today, not only about alcohol, but about things like televisions and cell phones and the internet and God knows what else. That if you're poor, you should be punished, you should have no happiness and no luxuries in your life. That is your lot, right? So if you're women, you shouldn't be drinking publicly, and people are upset that this is giving women an opportunity to do this. And if you're poor, you definitely shouldn't be drinking the same things that rich people drink. So that is really the motivation behind this larger temperance movement. So this is, let's call it the prehistory of alcohol. We're drinking it straight, we're not mixing it, most of it tastes like pine trees, and finally, women are allowed to drink it in a public setting. Yay. So let's move on to when we actually start getting something that looks like a cocktail. So that brings us to number 2, which is citrus. So mostly we mix lemons and limes. Historically, those are the most common things that we mix. As far as citrus, I just want to say, as a side note, that all of the citrus that we have today is descendant from 4 ancestral citrus plants: the mandarin, the pomelo, the citron, and the pepita. All of these are native to Southeast Asia, and all of the citrus we have now are these bred and crossbred again. In fact, that used to be a hobby in the 19th century before television or the internet or anything else that might occupy your time. People would crossbreed citrus and then collect unique varieties. The Buddha's hand, if you've ever seen it, this like crazy Cthulhu-looking thing, that is one of the most popular varieties that came from preserving these bizarre crossbreeds of citrus. So we start with 4, and everything else has evolved with them. Now, citrus, as I mentioned, was very readily available in Southeast Asia, and so was number 2A, which is tea. So we move to something called punch, which is believed to be derived from the Hindi word panch, which means 5. 5 for citrus, water or tea, distilled spirits, sugar, and spice, which is your basic recipe for making traditional punch. Not Mountain Dew or sherbet. I guess that's more of like a modern punch. So punch is the first mixed drink that we have, this very communal way of drinking. And it's believed to have originated in India, but not necessarily with native populations. It was the colonists, merchants, and sailors that were going to Southeast Asia, encountering distilled spirits like Batavia, Iraq there, as well as a lot of citrus, a lot of sugar, a lot of tea, which is all plentifully available in Southeast Asia. Now, on ships, men were already drinking distilled spirits with or without their ration of lime juice or lemon juice to prevent scurvy. So it seemed a pretty natural transition to start adding other things like tea and sugar and making sort of a larger mixed drink. There were indigenous mixed drinks, but a lot of them contain things like eggs, and we don't see that in the early European versions of punch. So it seems like it was inspired by local mixed drinks, but this basic punch recipe that would become a big part of European and American life seems to be derived from these British and Dutch colonists coming into the area. To give you an example, this is How to Mix Drinks from 1862. So when I'm talking about punch, I'm actually talking about the 18th century. It falls out of vogue by the time this book comes around. It would have been like what your grandfather drank and not cool at all. But How to Mix Drinks, as I'll talk about a bit later, is the first cocktail book there is. So in terms of looking at earlier recipes, other than handwritten notes, this is one of the few things we have to go from. Charles Dickens' punch recipes out there too. He was a pretty avid punch drinker, even though when he was alive it was unfashionable. There's also a milk punch recipe from Benjamin Franklin too that's on the interwebs. You can look both those up, and they were both like pretty standard punch recipes. But you can also see by the middle of the 19th century how varied and multitudinous the punch world is. This is just 2 pages of dozens of punches that the author here lists. So where are we drinking punch? So we know that women were drinking in gin houses, but looking at this image of punch drinking, you can see that there are men in this picture. And this is also eventually why punch is villainized, because you see the men are having just a grand old time smoking their pipes and drinking their big bowl of punch, which does pack a punch. I'm sorry, it does. So this is really something that was done most commonly within your household. There would be like a designated punch maker in your group, or eventually there were punch makers for hire that, especially on big holidays like New Year's Day in New York City, would go house to house preparing the punch for you. And then again, it is this communal drink that everyone is drinking from. Since it is in the private sphere, occasionally women would drink too, but it really is much more of a men's activity. And in a public sphere, you're seeing this in things more like coffee houses. And the coffee houses were places that were really men-only institutions that had a lot to do with politics and also trading too. So I'm going to do something a little bit unusual. People learn in 20-minute chunks. And one of the hardest parts about these seminars, especially when you're a couple drinks in, is staying focused. So you know exactly what I'm talking about. 90 minutes is a lot of information to stuff in your face. So I'm going to give you a minute to turn to your friend, talk about something you've learned, tweet something out. Hashtags are 8, the number 8 flavors, you know, and also TOTC2017. I'm at 4 pounds flour, all spelled out. And I'm going to time you, and I'm going to have a drink of water. So go. All right, come back to me. We're going to talk about nutmeg, which if there's one thing that's going to get anybody pumped, it's nutmeg. So I actually attended an entire seminar only about nutmeg last year, and I actually was like beside myself with nutmeg excitement. Nutmeg is like the coolest thing you could possibly ever eat in the 18th and 19th centuries. It comes from a tree that's native to the Banda Islands in Indonesia, which are traditionally known as the Spice Islands. It is a fruit. You can see that there's a fruity, pulpy part. There's that red, brainy-looking stuff. That's mace, which is something that's really seldom used in both mixology and baking today, but was very popular at the turn of the 19th century. Americans sort of lost a taste for it. No one is really sure why. And then in the center, the pit of this fruit is a nutmeg. So it's the seed of a tree. That's what a nutmeg is. Now, the Banda Islands were under control of the Dutch in the 18th century, and the Dutch kept nutmeg very scarce in markets, so it was incredibly expensive. And we don't see that a shift in this until in the early 19th century, trees are smuggled out of the Banda Islands to Grenada in the Caribbean. Grenada, either acceptable. And so now we have a source of nutmeg that's under British control and then can come to the colonies. So nutmeg is so popular historically that it has special accessories. My favorite annual job is grating the nutmeg with my nutmeg grater on the eggnog once year at Christmas. It is my job because I own not one but two nutmeg graters. This has been made the same. You can still buy this. Probably Cocktail Kingdom has it. It's the same patent since the 18th century. It's looked exactly the same. But after that shift, when nutmeg got more available in the 1840s, there were 12 different patents submitted to the government for nutmeg graters. So you can tell how crazy people were for nutmeg. Oh, to the point, I should say, and I've done some historical research about this, that before nutmegs became widely available, unscrupulous vendors would carve them out of wood. And so what I figured out, because I was kind of like, well, you just grate it. They say to take your grater with you to the market and grate it so you can smell it and make sure it's not wood. But essentially, if you're buying bulk, they would just mix it in the barrel. So if you're buying a handful, yeah. And I actually had an artist make a wooden nutmeg too to test this out and to see how long it would take. And it would be cost effective to fake nutmegs and sell them. You would actually make money. That's how valuable they were. Here's my favorite accessory though. This one's from the 18th century. It is a nut. I know, it's so cool. Isn't it? They're like $600, so I haven't bought one yet. It's sterling silver. Again, it gives you a sense how precious and valuable these were. Some of them had chains. You'd like put them on your belt, and the whole idea was you'd like take this to your friend's house and, like me, be like the nutmeg grater from your fancy sterling silver nutmeg carrier. So if anyone is interested in wooing me, you know what to get me. I have an Amazon wish list. You can just mail it there. Okay, so what we're really talking about in terms of nutmeg is the invention of the cocktail, which happens here in America. In a sense, some people are like, well, cocktails are just tiny punches, so like, how did you invent that? And it's like, well, fuck you, whatever. So we invented the tiny punches, but in a way it's different. So a punch is formulaic, right? You've got these five basic ingredients. And what really fascinates me about early cocktail culture is that today, people are gonna have a throwdown about whether martinis had vodka or gin. And if you make a Manhattan with anything but rye, like someone is like, this is Manhattan, you know the thing. But in the late 18th century, early 19th century, and it's, some drinks definitely date to late 18th century, like mint juleps are one of the originals. We have references to something called the cocktail from like 1802. So like right around there is when these drinks are coming to light. And usually they already exist before somebody writes about them, and they exist often long before someone writes a recipe for them. So that's key. That's true with drink history, that's true with food history too. Early drinks were formulas. So like here we have a page of slings. So a sling is alcohol plus water plus nutmeg. That's a sling. And you can put whiskey in it, and you can put brandy in it, and you can put gin, which was actually the most popular sling, the gin sling. So they didn't depend on the alcohol to be a certain drink. The drink was a formula, and you subbed in whatever alcohol you wanted or whatever alcohol you had. Cocktails were water plus alcohol, usually but not always whiskey, plus nutmeg sometimes, plus bitters. So my runner-up for number 3 are bitters, which also very specifically started as medicine. They were given to soldiers during the Revolutionary War. You got like a dram every morning, so it's thought of as healthy. And that drink I just mentioned, the cocktail, whiskey plus water plus bitters plus nutmeg sometimes, was often drunk first thing in the morning, and it was referred to as taking your bitters. That was your medicine to start the day. Some of the earliest bitters, like Hofstadter's, they're really credited as being cure-alls. These were stomach bitters, and actually a lot of bitters are known to settle your stomach. Other ones, though, were being marketed as cure-alls, and a lot of them started disappearing after the Pure Food and Drugs Act of 1906, which is the first law that forbade false advertising and required you to list ingredients on your product. And then, of course, the rest of them died out during Prohibition, except for Angostura and Peychaud's, which, as of 10 years ago when I started working in cocktail history, were still the only ones that existed, and Fee Brothers. And so it's quite amazing to walk into the market today and see how many cocktail bitters have appeared in the last decade. It's really, really, really remarkable. So we have this now drink culture, of which there are slings, there are toddies, there are cocktails. Again, I should note, a cocktail at this time wasn't the name of all of these drinks. It was the name of a specific drink. Slings, toddies, cocktails, juleps. You know what? Why listen to me when you can listen to Charles Dickens? Charles Dickens, sorry this picture is tiny. For whatever reason, it's the only photo that exists. This is a actual historic site on the Upper East Side called the Mount Vernon Inn, and they have a restored bar area. And bars were originally within hotels, and they were called bars because the area that it was in was barred off, both to protect the alcohol, but also because that's where the cash box was, so it would be locked up at night too. And they were spaces that were men-only spaces. The ladies' parlor would be somewhere else, and there wouldn't be alcohol there. Charles Dickens came to America in 1842. This was a thing that the Brits did in the early 19th century. You came and toured America, and while you were here, you had to go to a bar and you had to have a cocktail. That was like a thing that you had to check off your American tourist list. So here's what Dickens says about bars like these, actually specifically in New York City. The bar is a large room with a stone floor, and there people stand and smoke and lounge about all the evening, dropping in and out as the humor takes them. There, too, the stranger is initiated into the mysteries of gin sling, cocktail, sangaree, mint julep, sherry cobbler, timber doodle, and other rare drinks. So most of those drinks, we know what they are. Sherry cobblers I'm going to talk about. They were super big in the 1840s. Sangaree is like a sangria. We don't know what a timber doodle is. No one wrote down the recipe for that. Damn it. But I do have a little bit of a theory that's sort of a bigger theory. I should say that if you don't know him already, David Wondrich is like the cocktail guy. If you want to know more about the whole history of punch, he's got a book by that name. He also wrote Imbibe, which is really one of the first in-depth histories of cocktails. And one of the things he discusses at length is the origin of the word cocktail. No one really knows where that word came from, and he offers several plausible and also recounts the not so plausible theories. Here's mine. A timber doodle is another name for a woodcock, a bird, a hunted game bird. So I don't know what a timber doodle is, but I'm actually curious if it's a little bit of a joke or a play on words for this whole idea of what a cocktail is. Woodcock, cocktail, timber doodle, that's all I got so far. But food for thought. So one of the things you may have noticed about all the drinks I mentioned is that when I'm talking about the ingredients, water, bitters, nutmeg, alcohol, there is no ice. Everything was drunk room temperature or hot in the early 19th century and in the late 18th century. And so that brings us to number 4, which is ice. So in the early 19th century, ice was a luxury item, and the industry starts to boom in the middle of the 19th century, by the 1840s, really. Now, I know we're talking about flavors, but flavor is a combination of a lot of things. It's taste, our 5 basic tastes: sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and savory. Fatty is probably going to be added to that list soon. It's aroma, and while at the moment at least our tongues can only detect 5 different tastes, we can smell hundreds of thousands of different aromas. But it's also other sensations like texture. If something is smooth and creamy, I mean, think about what an egg does in a cocktail versus one that doesn't have that. And also temperature. Easiest way to think about it is ice cream. What does ice cream taste like when it's really, really cold? And what does ice cream taste like when it's a little bit melty? So putting ice in your drink or not, and how much ice, and if you're shaking it, that is actually affecting the flavor of the drink you present. So what makes the ice industry boom? Well, ice is being cut out of lakes in the 19th century, most of them in New England and the Boston area, lakes and ponds. And a big innovation comes in the 1830s because up until that point, men had been sawing the ice off the lakes by hand, and a new system was invented that you can actually see here where you can use horses to then operate saws and then collect this ice. These were stored in massive ice warehouses, really like all over New England, all up and down the Hudson River, and ice barons would ship this ice all over the world. This started with one guy named Frederick Tudor, and he was based out of Boston, and he's the one that got the idea that he would insulate a ship, and he would send ice all around the planet. Henry David Thoreau watched a team of Tudor's men cut ice off of Walden Pond, and he actually wrote about it. Here's what Thoreau had to say. "The sweltering inhabitants of Charleston and New Orleans Of Madras and Bombay and Calcutta, oh, drink at my well. The pure Walden water is mingled with the sacred water of the Ganges. He's not exaggerating. Tudor was known for shipping the first boat of ice to Calcutta. He had a market for it there because of the colonists. The one that he sent to the Caribbean didn't go as well. He had to show people how you could use ice. Because think about that. He is bringing ice. He's bringing the sensation of cold to parts of the world where cold has never existed. That is really pretty dramatic from the modern world. So ice is everywhere. Even here in hot, humid Louisiana, there's ice being shipped here that can be bought by bars. So ice begins featured very, very heavily in drinks in the middle of the 19th century. My runner-up here, though, is straws. Because when you've got a drink with a lot of ice in it, especially if it's like crushed ice or shaved ice, you need to have some way to get that in your mouth so it doesn't just spill all over your face, which we've all done, let's be real. So straws come into play. Now, straws have a much earlier history. The actual first depiction of someone using a straw comes from a Sumerian tablet. And the Sumerians brewed beer that they didn't filter, so they had these long straws they would use to sip the liquid from under the chaff and things that were floating on top. But they were like golden straws with like lapis lazuli laid in it. So they were fancy, fancy straws. In America in the 19th century, we start using a byproduct of the distilling industry, and that is rye straw. So you harvest the rye, the grain is going to distilling, the hay is going to feed animals, the straw is what's left in the field. Farmers would go back and harvest that and sell them to bars. And allegedly, the paper straw was invented by a man, Martin somebody, sorry, I can't remember it all. He was drinking a mint julep one day on his way home from work, and he didn't like the grassy flavor that these straws allegedly imparted into their drink. And he also felt that the longer it sat in the drink, they would kind of shed and come apart. I've actually tested that, and I've not had problems with it, but my straws are pretty thoroughly dried out. It could have been that fresher, greener straws were being used in the 19th century. Anyway, he didn't like it, so he invented paper straws, which I think fall apart a lot more readily than reeds. But I'm also kind of fascinated by the flavor that a straw would impart. Not only are you changing the way that you're ingesting liquid, but if that grassy flavor is there, that's kind of fascinating. And that's something to incorporate in the idea of a cocktail. So those two things came together in the sherry cobbler, which was the hippest drink of the middle of the 19th century. And it was because it is so modern. It is brandy, sugar, and you put some fruit in there. In the wintertime, it'd be like citrus. In the summer, you'd put seasonal berries. And it's just, and then most importantly, you pack it full of ice until it kind of piles up over the top, and you stick a straw in there. And people literally had to be taught how to use straws in the 1840s. We were not using them. So this drink, interestingly, I've seen it on menus recently. It's making a comeback in a big way. And today it's being recreated as sort of a nod to the past. But in the 1840s, this was as modern and sophisticated as you could possibly get. This has all of the latest technology in one glass, and it really blew people's minds. I don't have the full quote, but Dickens also wrote about this. He wrote a book called Martin Chuzzlewit right after he came to America, and there is like literally a page-long description of the main character drinking a sherry cobbler for the first time. This drink was revolutionary. I'm not even sure what to compare it to today. And we're transitioning from what Dickens was describing, those hotel bars, to places that were dedicated bars. And also bar culture is changing. Even in those hotel bars, mid-century, the bartenders were celebrities. We don't have a lot of their recipes, but we do have some of their names. Willard was the name of a famous guy in New York City. And a lot of times you went to the bar to see the bartender as much as you did to drink. The most famous bartender of the mid-19th century is Jerry Thomas, who's depicted in this image. He's doing his signature drink called the Blue Blazer, where you set alcohol on fire and pour it between two silver mugs. It's really just a whiskey hot toddy, but it's on fire, so that's exciting. I actually had the privilege once of seeing Dale DeGroff and David Wondrich recreate this drink, and one of them, I won't say which one, but you can guess, set the table on fire. So do you now have dedicated places? Again, you can look at this picture and see that these are male-only institutions. Women are not drinking hard alcohol in public. At the same time, there's a lot of German immigration to the United States, and German lager beer saloons are co-ed. Women can't go in groups by themselves, but they can go escorted with their families, their boyfriends, whatever, and also they have children that will go into these spaces. So there's one group of people that are usually upper middle class or wealthier men who are going to bars. But then we have these family institutions popping up in like places like New York City and Southeast Texas, big German areas, and that is really like scandalizing the American temperates people, that there are women and children drinking in bars. So that is how the alcohol is changing. Should we do one more? Yeah, I'm gonna do one more, and then I'm gonna give you your 1 minute chatty chat break. So now we're moving to the end of the 19th century. And anise, kind of interestingly, because this isn't a flavor that Americans are big on right now. It's never been, I mean, in my memory, a very popular flavor here, but it really had a moment at the end of the 19th century in America. And a lot of it had to do with the rise of absinthe. Now, I think what is interesting about this image is that it is a picture of a woman who's sitting and drinking this alcohol. In Europe, distilled spirits didn't have those same social connotations as, let's say, beer, which was considered this public male drink. So as opposed to in America where we're like, no, women don't go to bars, in Europe it was like, well, there aren't really rules for this. This is new. So much like the German beer saloons in the United States, in the mid to late 19th century, in France you had what was called the green hour, and that was from 5 to 7 p.m., and that was between work and going home. Everyone would go out to the bar. And there are depictions of not just men stopping home from work and having absinthe before they went home, but of their wives and their children coming to join them. And that actually will lead to the next ingredient we'll talk about in just a moment. So this, much like those German beer halls, was a social affair where you'd see men and women drinking together, and the kids would be drinking like fruit juice, as the descriptions say. Now, absinthe gets popular through a little bit of a fluke. It's a fairly recent addition in terms of alcohol. You know, gin is super old, whiskey and rum, hundreds of years. Absinthe is invented in the early 19th century, and it's invented by someone we just know as a female herbalist, Reed Witch, because that's what most female entrepreneurs were called. And so she was replaced by a fictional Dr. Ordinaire as the creator in the sort of story of the original absinthe. The recipe was purchased from her. It started being produced and became popular by the 1860s because at the same time, there is a louse called phylloxera, which is damaging the wine crop. So I noticed this first looking at culinary recipes, that early 19th century and 18th century, there was a lot of brandy incorporated in American cooking, and then suddenly by the end of the 19th century, there is not. And that's because the wine is dead. Like, the wine industry is tanking, they're losing all their vines, they can't produce, it's really a disaster. So whereas people have been drinking a lot of wine in places like France before, that gets replaced by this new herbal alcohol. Absinthe in a way is essentially like gin in that it's a neutral grain spirit that is infused, but it's notable for being very heavy on anise flavors, which comes from several sources usually. Anise is in the carrot family, by the way, also Queen Anne's lace, also caraway, which often goes into that too. They're all in the same family together. So it'll have a lot of anise, it'll have caraway. It'll have its most notorious ingredient, wormwood, which contains a chemical called thujone, which in very high concentrations can make you hallucinate. That is part of the reason that absinthe was banned for a very long time, most of the 20th century in America, until a New Orleans entrepreneur lobbied the government and proved that there is not enough thujone in absinthe for you to have any sort of side effects. But the reason that absinthe was so villainized, and you've probably heard these stories too, of that people went crazy and murdered their families. There was a very famous case in France where a man was tried, essentially absinthe was tried, that he had drank absinthe and then he committed a murder. These were all funded by the wine industry. Basically, it was like the wine consulate that was trying to villainize not alcohol, but absinthe specifically, because by the early 20th century, it was sort of getting its legs back, but absinthe had now replaced it. So a lot of the villainizing of absinthe was built up by the wine industry as they were trying to recover. And yeah, the guy who drank absinthe did commit a murder, but he'd also drank like a jug of wine and like a fifth of gin, and then like had some like coffee with alcohol. Like he drank everything. But it was the absinthe that was pulled out too. So these are from The Ideal Bartender, 1917. By the end of the 19th century, we start seeing a lot more bar books too, and you see a lot of not just absinthe, but other things like chartreuse, ouzo, other sort of anise-flavored alcohols and liqueurs appearing rather briefly around the turn of the 20th century and then disappearing after Prohibition. Y'all have 1 minute. Go ahead. So another ingredient that appears just after the turn of the 20th century is grenadine. And grenadine, many people are surprised to learn, is originally made with pomegranates. In fact, the word grenade means pomegranate in different variations in Spanish and in French. So this ingredient replaces something earlier. This is a recipe for raspberry syrup, and this is again from like the 19-teens, or a cocktail recipe that includes raspberry syrup. This is also what we see in Jerry Thomas's book from the 1860s, that you see fruit syrups, most commonly raspberry, that are being used to add that fruity taste, maybe that tartness, that sweetness, and most importantly, that color. There's a really famous 19-teens cocktail called the Florodora that is made with gin, ginger ale, yes, gin, ginger ale, lime juice, and raspberry syrup to give it the color. It's a good summer drink. So we see raspberry syrup first, and then we start to see grenadine, this pomegranate syrup. And that is what the kids are drinking while their parents are drinking absinthe in cafes in France. They're having like lemonade, or they're having grenadine, essentially Shirley Temples. So it's seen more of as a fruit juice until the early 20th century we start mixing it into cocktails. And a lot of the drinks will replace raspberry syrup with grenadine by the 19-teens. And then these are some of the more famous original grenadine cocktails, particularly the Jack Rose, which is lemon juice, applejack, and grenadine, which is also a really great drink that is very visually appealing. I would say that these are the first drinks, and we'll come back to this idea, that when someone orders them at the bar, they have a really striking color. And that is what's attracting more people to order them and drink them. It's really about the appearance, whereas up until this point, everything has been like brownish. That's what all drinks look like. Now you've got this bright pink, this bright red drink coming off the bar, and people are really amazed by that. Now, grenadine today is rarely, if ever, made from pomegranates in America. Rose's grenadine, it's not. It's like yellow food coloring, yellow, red, sugar, citric acid. It's essentially like a flavored food coloring. Interestingly, that was the standard in America for all of the last century. Kind of at the very, very, very beginning, the 1880s and 1890s, we seem to be using real pomegranate grenadine syrup. That happens because we do have pomegranates growing here even in the 18th century, but it seems like there's a boom in cultivation in Florida, which makes it really easy to get it to places like New York City and Boston and New Orleans, the centers of cocktail culture. And so there's this new ingredient that we start using in drinks shortly before the turn of the 20th century. But we're not cultivating pomegranates like Europe is, like where they're native to, in the Middle East and the Mediterranean. So it's really expensive and inconvenient and seasonal to make grenadine in America from pomegranates. So there are patents that are filed at the turn of the 20th century that are essentially Rose's grenadine, that are just citric acid and food coloring and sugar. And some of them even have some other flavors in it, like vanilla or cinnamon. They're like spiced grenadines. So in a way, is this a fake ingredient? Yes, but it's a historical fake ingredient. So it's up to you. Chemicals have been around for a long time. So traditionally, Europe uses pomegranates, but America has used the fake stuff pretty much always. But of course, now I am curious to have some of these classic cocktails made with real pomegranate syrup as opposed to grenadine in this country, because that is a flavor that I've never tasted and would certainly genuinely change the flavor profile as well as the texture of these classic drinks. So drinks start changing color. And a really significant event happens, while essentially this cookbook is coming out, this cocktail book. This is from Sloppy Joe's Cocktails in 1932, and Sloppy Joe's was located in Cuba, because I don't even have a slide for where are we drinking at this point, because we're not. I mean, we are, but really what we're doing is drinking really terrible alcohol, what we can get our hands on. It's mostly gin during Prohibition because it's the easiest to make. You buy neutral grain spirit, you maybe put juniper berries in it, you probably just put like some pine flavoring in it, and there you go, gin. So that's another reason that grenadine became popular, because it was something you could use to disguise really shitty alcohol. I have this dream, which I don't think is a very good business model, but a decade ago, speakeasy bars were really popular. I want to open up a real speakeasy bar, like something really authentic, where the drinks are just terrible. Just awful, so you can get that real Prohibition experience. So I often say that we kind of needed Prohibition as a country. Back when we were drinking the cocktail first thing in the morning in the 1820s, we were per capita drinking 4 to 5 gallons of alcohol. And I'm talking alcohol, like between cider, mostly whiskey, rum, like pure alcohol per capita per person per year. And keep in mind that women are not drinking that much, not drinking as much as men in the early 19th century. And children are not drinking that much either. So to say that every single person in America was drinking 4 to 5 gallons of spirits, that's insane. That's when the temperance movement starts, because we are literally a little bit drunk all the time. And we elected Andrew Jackson. So it kind of goes to show, his whole campaign ran on the fact that he was touring around and rolling barrels of whiskey out to his audience. That was an expected part of a presidential campaign. So the temperance movement starts up, and it's really based around women and children whose lives are being ruined because their husbands are drinking away their money, who aren't coming home, who there's domestic abuse. So, it's easy, I think, especially to place like Tales of the Cocktail, to disparage temperance and to laugh at it. But I actually think it was truly important to our culture, and that we are a better country for that having happened. Now, in comparison, the average American per capita drinks about 1 to 2 gallons of spirits per year. So that is about a 75% drop in our consumption of alcohol. So it's both untrue that temperance and Prohibition didn't work. It absolutely did. Here we are. And it's also untrue that Americans today drink a lot. We don't, if we compare it to what we were doing 150 years ago. All that being said, though, the really bad part about Prohibition, well, there's crime and everything, but that's the whole other conversation, is that it did ruin cocktail culture. It ruined it twofold. I compare it to the startup of the craft distilling industry today. So within the past decade, laws have changed state by state. I'm most familiar with Brooklyn because I'm from New York, that about 10 years ago, a distiller's license went from $30,000 a year to about $1,000 a year. So that allowed small distillers to start. And actually, after Prohibition, those laws favored large companies. It really was trying to eliminate small batch distillers and brewers. But we got homebrewing in the 1970s, and that changed the game. Now these small batch distillers are changing. I bring all this up to say the first alcohols coming out of Brooklyn were vodkas, moonshine, and gin. And of course, that is because those spirits don't have to be aged. If you want a 10-year whiskey, you have to wait 10 years. So those things are going to start coming around now, but originally we had essentially neutral grain spirits. That's what could be sold. And that's what we see after Prohibition. We weren't aging alcohol, it was illegal, so now we're starting with things like gin again. Additionally, World War II happens. So the places that we were importing good alcohol from are devastated, are under the control of foreign powers. Basically, the only other place we could get alcohol from was Russia. So that brings us to two different ideas. One is it's post-Prohibition and post-World War II that we really start adding, depending on where you're from, cola, soda, or Coke, to our alcohols. It's simple. It's doing exactly what it did in Prohibition. It's hiding the taste of not very good alcohol. And especially as we start drinking more things like vodka, you're just kind of like throwing it in the sugary stuff. I should say that there's actually a history of alcohol in cola. Vin Mariani is a 19th century creation that was a combination of cocaine and wine. It was real and very, very popular. And when John Pemberton when he created the original Coca-Cola, it was actually just a ripoff of Vin Mariani. It was cocaine and wine. But Prohibition came sooner to the county in Georgia where he was producing this. Temperance laws were state by state. So he needed to come up with a non-alcoholic version of this, which was Coca-Cola, which still had cocaine in it, but no wine. So there is actually a history of mixing alcohol and spirits in a way too. And certainly during Prohibition, the soda fountain thrived, not just because there was no longer a bar you could go to, but coming back to women's liberation, at soda fountains, they were some of the first places where women could go out in public in groups together, and where a man and a woman could go on a date without a chaperone. So it's not just the fact that there wasn't alcohol, there was also personal freedom, particularly for women, tied into soda fountains and ice cream fountains too. The most famous cocktail that uses cola is the Cuba Libre, and it is believed to have been invented in Cuba shortly after the Spanish-American War. Once Cuba is liberated from Spain, a lot of American products start flowing into it, one of them being Coca-Cola. It's probably descended from an earlier drink known as El Drac, which is also thought to be the ancestor of the mojito, which is sort of a really raw rum with a really raw sugar mixed together, and like maybe some water and maybe some mint. So it's got those sort of molasses notes that Coca-Cola would have the same color. So now you're using maybe still a pretty raw rum, but you're mixing it with Coke as opposed to molasses too. This is from a Cocktails and Snacks from 1965. So we see it being pretty mainstreamed by the 1960s, and you probably know this better as a rum and Coke. Although the lime is considered the difference between a Cuba Libre and a rum and Coke, although I never had a rum and Coke without a lime in it. And so my runner-up in this too is the idea of no flavor, that suddenly, because of our relationship with Russia during World War II, our country is being flooded with vodka. And again, we've lost a lot of drinking culture. We want drinks that are really simple, like the Cuba Libre, soda, alcohol, boom, you're done. And also, it becomes a generational divide, because it's honestly, it's old people that are drinking alcohol who were like yous in the 1920s, who are like, think Don Draper, he's drinking in the 1960s. But what are the 20-somethings doing? They're smoking weed. Like, they're not interested in cocktail culture. So that's another way that there's sort of this dearth of innovation, because the younger generation didn't think it was hip to be drinking. They were smoking a lot of pot. And now we do both. I mean, not me though. So this is again from Cocktails and Snacks, but 1960s, and this is 2 pages worth of vodka cocktails, which you don't see before this point. Really, it's in the 1960s that you see vodka recipes appearing in cocktail books, and it's pretty significant. There's a big divide. And I wanted to point out, the Bloody Mary, which even though that's an older drink, was originally made with gin. And it was called the something fish. Does anybody know? The red snapper, yes. See, fish, it's in there. The red snapper. It's actually, I find it a pretty good drink. So it's in the 50s and 60s that it transitions to be a Bloody Mary with vodka. And where are we drinking? Not really out in public. We're drinking at home. This is the era when we see wet bars being installed in private, which also does mean that women are drinking more too, because women drinking in private has always kind of been okay. But now, really the emphasis in all parts of American culture is on the home. We're moving out of cities, out of the country, and into suburbs. You are focused on your family and your family life, so even drinking culture comes inside the home as well. So we're drinking terrible drinks in our terribly decorated homes. And I guess we're just drinking our mid-century sadness away. That's all I can assume. And then unfortunately, it only gets worse, because we're about to move into the late 20th century, and some of you are probably alive to remember that era, and a really significant moment in 1986 when the first flavored vodka was launched. It's important, right? You know, I'm up here to present not an idealized version of cocktail history, but what really happened. In the 1990s, flavored vodka sales made up 10% of the vodka industry. Today, it makes up 25%, although, interestingly, sales are declining in terms of flavored vodka. So the era is coming to an end. Now, one of the things that I find really fascinating is that the first flavored vodka release was in 1986, and it wasn't pucker, it was absolute. It was Absolute Pepper, which is a hot pepper flavored vodka. And vodkas flavored with, like, let's say cayenne, let's call it, as opposed to black pepper, remain one of the most popular categories and most commonly used of the flavored vodkas. That and, of course, citrus, which makes a lot of logical sense. If any of you here in the past decade or so have used a flavored vodka, it's probably been one of those two, rather than marshmallow, apple pie, pumpkin spice, which on one level I'm fascinated with. I put those in the category of science flavoring, where that pumpkin pie vodka is trying not only to recreate the flavor of pumpkin spice, but also some of the textural experience of it. And that to me is really interesting, where we're turning to flavor chemists to create these flavors as opposed to mixing ingredients. But this had it was in this moment that the start of where we are now began. Because bars were also, and you probably remember this too, making their own flavored vodkas in-house. And you would go into the bar and see the big glass thing, and they're soaking something in there, and it looked really cool, and it kind of engaged you. And it was different because you were coming from an era of maybe ordering rum and cokes, and now you saw this thing being made behind the bar. That was a pretty important transition. And that is the beginning. There's more to it too, but not before we get to my runner-up for flavor 8, cranberry juice. Because you know it's true that this cocktail dominated the turn of the millennial, right? So late 90s, early 2000s, it was the Cosmo. I actually kind of remember this as being my first adult drink. I was at a conference and I was out and I'm I don't know what to order. I thought it was terrible at the time. I don't know if it was just because I was 21 and hadn't drank a thing yet, or if it was not a great drink. But much like those early grenadine drinks, it was the color that was really appealing about this. Once somebody ordered it, everybody saw it and inquired about it. And then, of course, once it appeared in several episodes of Sex and the City, that was the end. This was the drink. It seemed sophisticated, it was different than a rum and coke, and it was simple, which is why bartenders at the time liked it. These drinks were simple. What we're going to have today, as we're finishing up, it's going to be coming out in just a few minutes, is the earliest recipe that has been found for a cosmopolitan. And I also have to credit David Wondrich for this recipe. Oh, and by the way, I got to give a shout out to Camper English too. He has an amazing amount of grenadine research on his website, Alcademics. He also presents a lot here. David Wondrich does too, so you should try to get into those seminars if you can. What's interesting about this one from 1989 is that it's, of course, made with rum as opposed to vodka, or citrus vodka is the other variation. And this is what we're going to serve, so you can try it and pass your own judgment on it and see what you think and see if it was improved or ruined by being replaced with vodka. I'll give you a second to write that down if you want to. I also want to talk about, so on my Twitter feed, there is an article that I found while doing research for this from the year 2000. It's in the New York Times. It's called The Greening of the Martini, and it's about this amazing new drink called the Appletini. Pretty fucking incredible, right? And it is a rundown of all these New York City bars and how they're serving their own variations of the Appletini. And even mentions that Robert De Niro ordered it at the Tribeca Film Festival and they were ashamed because they didn't have apple pucker behind the bar, and so they bought a case the next day. Super fascinating. Oh, thank you. Oh, it's so lovely. Let's give a quick hand to our caps. They do a lot of hard work. Really. Like every time I'm presented with a garnish at Tales, I'm like, oh my God, it's the most perfect lemon peel I've ever seen. And they made like 200 of these. It's amazing. So we've got all these variations in the martini, and again, they're simple and they're super visual, and like it's easy for bartenders to make them and just sell them. And so where were we drinking them? Probably places like this. You're laughing so hard because you obviously, is that you in that photo in the middle? We were all there, we all did it. It's probably some of the reason that some of us are sitting in this room right now is this fascination with bar culture, because of course that leads us to the present day. So as a reaction to all these simple cocktails made with these pre-flavored, pre-bottled Appletini pucker, we get bar culture right now, which really emphasizes craftsmanship, ingredients, which is pulling very heavily from ideas that we haven't seen in the 19th century. We essentially lost bar culture for about 100 years. Oh, and I should say that the big thing we have to thank like bar culture of the 80s and 90s for is that it finally becomes appropriate for women to drink in public. That to me is pretty shocking. Yeah, woo, but also like, come on. It's like took us how long? So like now I as a woman can go and have a drink at a bar and that is considered socially acceptable. That is pretty significant in terms of this broader cocktail history, and that you can see the ladies of Sex and the City drinking and it's sophisticated and cool and you want to be like them. So now we have modern bar culture in that sense, in that men and women can drink together. What a novel idea. But also in terms of the cocktails, that they're pulling from the 19th century, they're focused on craftsmanship, they're focused on, you might wait like a good 20 minutes for your drink to come out from behind the bar, and that becomes part of the experience. And that many people choose to sit at the bar so they can witness these things being done. And I like drinks though when they fall somewhere in the middle, because I have ordered drinks and they're like getting down blow torches and like having a cat sneeze on it, and like there's just, like it just goes a little far in the other way too. So I'm not going to answer this question. What I want you to think about is what the next flavor will be, because I think it's a little bit too hard. We can guess, we can't know. You need a little bit of space to be able to tell, all right, well, that was the flavor of the moment, that kind of defined the time. But I'm really curious for you professionals and enthusiasts what you think. So I don't want you to answer that right now, but if you see me around, whether after this or at the book signing, I'm also reading from this book that I wrote at the Legendary Authors. I was pretty amazed. Yes, I'm a legendary author. It's my first book done. Crossed off. But this afternoon I'm reading in the salon with Jeff Beachbum-Berry and Jim Meehan, so that's a pretty big honor too. But all I'm saying is if you see me around, let's have a conversation about it. I would love to know what you think the sort of flavor of the future is. Having said that, the earliest accounts of cooling drinks or cooling food actually comes from a couple, like 900 AD. In China and in Persia, they were going up into mountains and collecting snow and packing it into backpacks that were insulated with straw. So like if you put ice together, it keeps things colder essentially. And the ice houses were not just straw insulated, but were often buried underground too, were often somewhat submerged. And I don't know what other insulation they were putting in the walls, but they were well insulated enough that one year, which was kind of a cooler summer in the 19th century, the ice lasted all the way through to the next October. So it became by the 1850s and 1860s, like an affordable luxury that you could even buy just a chip of ice to suck on in the summertime from the ice vendor that was going by. You could have ice delivered to your home or to your party. And of course, like concessioners and bars were using it very, very heavily in the middle of the 19th century. Much easier and inexpensive to access in the north, but also accessible here in the south. I would say as is, as is shown by the popularity of the mint julep. Like the mint julep is pretty heavily reliant on ice. So there was a time and a place for ice, but also traditionally drunk early in the summer too, when ices might be available. So the four ancestral citrus varieties are the mandarin, the pomelo, the citron, and the pepita. And out of those, only the last one, which is spelled P-E-P-E-D-A, is not so commonly used. I think its common name is sour orange. It does appear in Chinese cuisine, and it was used in medieval European cuisine as a souring agent. Pomelos are still around. It's used a lot in Middle Eastern culture. Mandarins or oranges, the original orange. And citron is interesting because it's a fruit. It's a citrus fruit where you don't use the pulp. You most commonly can't use the rind or candy the zest and the rind together. So it's very like fleshy and only has a little bit of pulp in the middle. So if you couldn't hear, he was saying he's a flavor chemist, and what they're seeing from their clients is requests for like citrus and bitters. So even when you're sort of recreating the flavors within a laboratory, you're still referencing essentially these 19th century flavors too. And you don't think too of flavor chemists being all about artificial flavors, which actually I personally have nothing against too. It's about blending flavors from multiple sources to recreate an experience is how I would call it. Givaudan is often here. I don't know if they're here this year, but when they are, they're really fascinating to talk to. And yeah, often bring some interesting products that have a lot of potential to work with. Other thoughts or questions? Well, if you want to chat with me more, you know you can find me at the back of whatever room this is. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for listening. My pleasure.